We're just going to take a moment for everybody to load into our Zoom session. It just takes a minute, and then we'll get started. Hello from Washington, D.C., and welcome to today's very important webinar where we'll discuss the new sanctions put on Russia in response to their unprovoked attack on Ukraine and discuss the historical context for U.S. sanctions on Russia and the Soviet Union. Before we get to today's event, a few updates about upcoming WITA events. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern, we are hosting our annual Trade Councils program featuring the 4 councils from the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees. That event is off the record and will not be broadcast at any other time except during the event tomorrow. So if you want to see it, you need to register in advance and watch it live on Zoom. We'll post a link in the chat to register. We also have a very special event next Tuesday, March 15th at 2 p.m., where we welcome the South Korean Trade Minister on the 10th anniversary of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, KORUS, which went into effect on March 15th, 2012. We'll have an expert panel join the trade minister for that discussion as well, which is especially timely with the presidential election concluded in Korea this week. We're also planning a follow-on to today's event later in March to discuss the impact and implications of sanctions on bilateral and global trade. Watch your email for information about that event, which we hope to announce shortly. If you've been on any of our 117 WITA webinars these past 2 years, you know that we like to tell you about some of the people you're in community with at today's event, even if you cannot see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Ambassador Carla Hills, President and CEO of Hills & Company and the former U.S. Trade Representative. My good friend, Ambassador Ira Shapiro, former General Counsel at USTR and former Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Jay Rockefeller. The author David Marinis, Distinguished Visiting Professor at Vanderbilt University, and Randy Levinas, U.S.-Russia Business Counsel, who I am sure has had a busy few weeks. Welcome, Randy, Carla, Ira, and David, and we're delighted you could all join us today, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this live on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can before the end of today's event. You should have also received an email with today's program so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. You have a fantastic panel today led by my good friend and friend of many of yours, Paula Stern, the former chair of the U.S. International Trade Commission and author of Water's Edge, Politics of the Making of American Foreign Policy. Paula brought this idea to our attention less than 2 weeks ago, and I encourage all of you to suggest ideas for panels at events@wita.org. We're also pleased to welcome back to the WITA stage 3 guests who have been with us previously, either in person or online. Ambassador Alan Larson, the former Undersecretary of State for Economics and Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, and Ambassador of the OECD, now at Covington and Burling, LLP. Clay Lowery, Executive Vice President of the Institute of International Finance and former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department. Kevin Wolf, a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer & Feld, and former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration. And a new guest on the WITA platform, Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at the Center for Transatlantic and Trans-European Space Studies at Virginia Tech University, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and Illiberalism Studies at George Washington University. We read a paper she co-authored with Anders Östlund in 2021 called The Impact of Western Sanctions on Russia and How They Can Be Made Even More Effective. And we knew we had to have her join us today. Welcome, Maria, Alan, Clay, and Kevin. Paula?
Thank you so much. Thrilled to have this great panel. And I want to open the discussion with a little historic background. But even before I do that prelude, I have to say that I had tuned in early this morning to hear the chief economic advisor to Ukraine's president. His name is Oleg Ustenko. And while he was supposed to be talking about sanctions and economic issues, his plea was for military arms. So I just need to put that in the context. But I also want to mention that he talked not only about the present, but he talked about the future post this war. So Ken, as you said, asked me to put this a little bit in historic context. It's a geoeconomist today. And I hope in the questions we will get to the future, because I think we're at, and we're watching a tectonic geostrategic shift. But back to the history, back to the future. It may not repeat itself. It certainly rhymes. Today it is a dirge. And it's because the United States prominently is a nation of immigrants, refugees who come from someplace else, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, China, anywhere. And that is the book that I wrote about years ago. Our people remain connected to their overseas cousins. And while we have, as a nation, this isolationist streak, repeatedly, the US re-engages with the world. We did that all the way back even in 1912, when the US withdrew what had been most favored nation tariff treatment to the then Russia. And we did it because of, ironically, an immigrant issue even then. And then in the 70s, and that's the book that I wrote about, Congress prevailed over President Nixon's White House policy of détente that he was trying to roll out with the then USSR, that gave communist Russia, USSR, and trade status that was called most favored nation tariff treatment, treating them like all other trading partners. But back in the 70s, there was a senator, Scoop Jackson. He was a Cold Warrior. He also had presidential ambitions, and he challenged Nixon's détente policy. And he managed to rally both houses of Congress to block the White House's promise to remove the economic sanctions that had occurred on the so-called non-market economies. That congressional executive tug of war lasted 2.5 years. And now, a half century later, both branches of the US government in only 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, have rallied all of America's economic resources and then worked not alone, but in tandem with our allies in the EU, plus Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, and on, to try to convince Russia to stop its punishing military attacks on Ukraine. Economic sanctions have to be used when military force is deemed too dangerous. Lord knows the US has no problem using military force, sometimes too much. But since the nuclear age, the US has been constrained by the dire rationale of MAD, which is mutual assured destruction doctrine, that recognizes the danger of a military battle with another nuclear nation, Russia, because that would lead us to be in this MAD, mutually assured destruction range. So that brings us to this discussion today of economic sanctions, financial sanctions, export controls that have been rolled out in record time, as I said. And we're going to leave aside the energy sanctions because WITA has organized another day for that discussion. So will these sanctions work? As I said, there's unity, unlike back in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, between the Congress and the executive branch. And also there's incredible unity diplomatically overseas. We had in 2014 a trial run when Russia took over Crimea and parts of the Donbass. And there we didn't have our allies with us as much. Our sanctions weren't as great. Something else is very different from back in the 70s with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and that is Russia is globalized, or had been globalized up until a couple of weeks ago. And there is, the corporations are uniquely different today. They care about their reputational risk. as well as just the bottom line. And then finally, as I said, Russia is different. It got wired in 30 years into the global economy. It is no longer the autarky that it was back in the 70s, when it was basically had self-isolated itself from the United States. And the big difference we'll talk about is now China is on the scene. So I'd like to turn now with that little historic prelude to Alan, Ambassador Larson. If you would give us, based on your decades of diplomatic experience, a picture of what you see in the of these economic sanctions.
Well, sure. Thank you very much for that great lead-in, Paula. You know, one of the first signs that we were going into a Cold War with the Soviet Union after World War II was when Moscow surprised the United States by standing aloof from the economic institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and the GATT, predecessor to the WTO. Another big event during that period was the Nixon-Kissinger easing of relations with China, which created a split with the Soviet Union, and that was a very important break in the Cold War. And the third big geopolitical development was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That changed everything for me as a diplomat, because it became really important to start working with the Warsaw Pact countries, to integrate them into the Western economy, to try to do the same with Russia as well. I was on my way to the OECD as our ambassador, and was carried with me a proposal to bring Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia into the OECD. We also tried to work with the Baltic states on their economic issues. One of the things that is sort of forgotten in this day and age is that late in the 90s, Russia ran into a huge debt crisis, and it needed a $22 billion IMF bailout and a Paris Club rescheduling of debts that, along with Treasury colleagues, I went to Paris and helped negotiate. Very remarkable thing to do with a nuclear superpower. It was shortly after that Vladimir Putin became president of the Soviet Union. It was clear at the very beginning that he was nursing grievances about what he considered to be the great tragedy of the 20th century. And in his mind, that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia got integrated into certain groups. It was invited into the group of 7, and it ingratiated itself with the United States on certain technical issues. Like, they were among the strongest supporters of a US proposal to reinforce cockpit doors after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001. The efforts to draw Russia into the world economy continued, and as a private citizen, I was asked to testify on the rescission of the Jackson-Vanik legislation. It became called the Magnitsky Act because there needed to be a compromise in light of the fact that we wanted to extend unconditional MFN to Russia for level playing field reasons, but we remain very concerned about Russia's human rights abuses, including the death in custody of Sergei Magnitsky, who'd been very critical of Russian abuses of human rights. So that was an interesting opportunity to be able to testify in favor of that and to advocate something that was called a rule of law for business proposal that we actually got into the law. As you mentioned, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea stimulated a very, very deep cooperation between the United States in particular and European allies on sanctions that included individual sanctions on those who were deemed responsible oligarchs supporting the regime, but also broad swaths of the Russian economy. Another big development on the sanctions front during the Trump administration was the development of these technical or export controls on technology that I know Kevin will be talking about more using the foreign direct product rule. It is a back to the future moment, as you suggested, where we're now considering going back to repeal the repeal of Jackson-Vanik, where we've imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia to the extent that it's arguably more isolated now than it was during the period of the Soviet Union. And why don't I leave that overview now and turn it back to you, Paula?
Thank you so very much. I really learned a lot there. Well, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what's happened in the last couple of weeks, having set this historic backdrop. Clay, you have been in and out of the government, particularly dealing with finance and the Department of Treasury and other agencies of the US government. Would you tell us about the sweep of financial sanctions that have been issued here in the United States and in cooperation with our allies?
Thanks, Paula, and thanks to WITA for having me here today. Let me just say that the sanctions that have been taking place after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so roughly about 2 weeks ago, a little more than 2 weeks ago now, in many respects were completely unprecedented. And here's why. There were 4 reasons. One, Paula mentioned very early on, which was that the speed in which they were imposed. I mean, they were put in place, frankly, over a weekend. Second is, also Paula noted this, is the multilateralism, the coordination that was done, probably more so than almost in any other case. The only case probably that comes close was Iran back around 2012, and that took years to get to that point, not weeks or days, actually. Third is the comprehensiveness of the sanctions. So let me go into that in a second. And then the fourth reason, and by far probably the biggest reason why it's unprecedented, is that this is the biggest economy that has ever been sanctioned in a major way. Russia's the 11th largest economy in the world. It's pretty engaged in a lot of, especially on commodities and in trade markets and somewhat in the financial markets. So in that respect, it was unprecedented because of all those issues. Now, the comprehensiveness part is the part where you basically say it wasn't just sanctions on Russia's debt, which actually had been done in 2013 and was expanded in this round of sanctions. But it was also going much further in terms of hitting particularly the Russian state-owned banking sector, which is around 60 to 80% of all Russian banking assets are in this sector. So that was a pretty significant to go after that sector in a major way, not just on some small parts of it, but in including doing regular dollar transactions. Third was the sanctions that kind of caught the newspaper's attention, and which was the SWIFT sanctions. So SWIFT, basically, just so your audience is aware, is in some respect is nothing more than a communication system, except for it is the way to make communications much more efficient. So you have to do it when you do a transaction, you need to communicate that you're doing this transaction and that there's confirmation processes that are involved. So it's not a clearing or settlement. There's no money flowing through, but it is a very important messaging system. The only other time it's been used that in a major way again was Iran. So that was it was a big deal. And in fact, actually, a lot of the European countries, particularly Germany, did essentially a 180 on that. They said that they didn't want to do it, and then all of a sudden they did want to do it.
Mhm.
And then fourth, and maybe most importantly, was the sanctions on the central bank. Central bank had built up a kind of reserves that was the fourth largest in the world. What the sanctions were was basically you would not be able to do swap transactions. So the Russians couldn't do a transaction with their reserves overseas. Now, why that's important is because it basically cuts off at least a line, not totally cuts off, but cuts off a line to hard revenue and hard currency for their own banking system. The other thing they did was they froze the assets of the central bank. So if there are assets at the New York Fed, which I promise you there are, they're now frozen. They're just stuck at the New York Fed. So you can't bring them back and you can't utilize them if you're Russia's central bank. Now, what is the implications of this? It hits the Russian markets in a major way, which is basically since this all happened. So now Monday last, so a week, almost 2 weeks ago, the markets have essentially been closed. I mean, the ruble fell around 40% right off the bat. They had to close that. They've tried to reopen it, but it's hard. The stock market has been closed. They've had to raise interest rates. They've had bank runs. Maria can talk much more about some of these issues than me. All of this is going to the idea is to isolate Russia. So Paula used the word autarkic back in the Soviet days. Essentially, this is turning Russia into an autarkic society again. And that's not going to be good. By the way, it's not just going to be bad for the Russian leadership. It's going to be bad for the Russian people. And probably, there's a sorry about that because obviously the Russian people didn't do all this, but that is going to happen. And so we are projecting, at least that Russia's economy will fall we're suggesting a 15% contraction in GDP. Now that is
Say who
huge.
we is. It's important to say.
So the Institute of International Finance and our economists have made a projection. Now we realize there's a lot of assumptions.
Number again?
It was 15%. And so if you look, a lot of, I think I saw JP Morgan had a negative 11%. I think Goldman had a negative 10%. So there's a lot of different, obviously people are trying to make assumptions here, but the idea is you're isolating the economy. There was also more sanctions taking place, but a lot of those I think Kevin's going to go into. So I'll stop there and can take questions in the next round.
Thank you so much, Clay. And yes, Kevin, you're up next. We have, again, record time, but there's some very novel sanctions. Wondering if you can give us an overview. As I said, I think maybe before you got on the intro when we were talking with each other, you've been developing some very detailed descriptions. So you hot off the press just last night. So could you share top line what we've seen happen in the last 10 days, 2 weeks on exports controls? Is your I'm not hearing.
Yeah, no, I'm on. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So first, a broad comment about the policy aspects, about what a paradigm shift of the types of export controls are in Russia. And every time I say Belarus or Russia, I also mean Belarus. Those were added in parallel. So the historical purpose since the end of the Cold War of export controls has been to regulate weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, and either the bespoke or dual use items that are necessary for their development, production, or use, the parts, components, and technology. And those were coordinated by 4 multilateral regimes to achieve those objectives. And the US had a small number of controls that were controlled unilaterally in order to magnify sanctions against Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba historically. These are called anti-terrorism controlled items, even though they don't have anti-terrorism necessarily as their issue. They're less sensitive aircraft parts, semiconductors, et cetera. And the purpose of these controls is not to regulate items because of their inherent sensitivity for WMD or conventional military or for anti-terrorism related purposes. It's to achieve strategic economic objectives in order to enhance the economic sanctions that Clay described, in order to cut off the flow from outside of Russia of the US, and here's where it's key, foreign made, non-US made parts, components, accessories, software, technologies that are important to key sectors of the Russian economy. The aerospace sector, the shipbuilding and maritime sector, navigation, avionics, sensors, lasers, telecommunications, computers, microelectronics. The way in which these sanctions are structured, or these export controls of sanctions are structured, is to be able to cut off the flow from the US and in coordination with 30 allies, these types of items. The rule basically boils down to if something is on a commerce control list, this list of multilateral and unilateral items, then its export from the US is banned with very few exceptions. And its export from a group of 30 countries, the EU, the Five Eyes countries, Japan and Australia, they have committed to impose the same controls and same licensing policies from their countries. And then the novel way in which the US is reaching non-US made items outside the United States and outside one of these allied countries is if you use US tools, US equipment, or equipment that's made from US software technology, or you use US software or technology to produce a wholly foreign made item, no US dollars, no US persons, no US content, no US components, no US company, no US intersection of any sort, except you use a piece of production equipment as one part of many to produce that non-US made aircraft part or semiconductor or ship part. And that type of component, that type of equipment is on this commerce control list or produced with software technology from it. So it's effectively subjected the entire planet to US export controls using not the leverage of dollars, which is the leverage of sanctions, but the leverage of US equipment and software to affect and assert jurisdiction over non-US made items. And then the last point is that this actually has implications, I believe, for export controls far beyond Russia, because what we have now is this extraordinary amount of multilateral or plurilateral cooperation. And plurilateral is a use of individual unilateral authorities by allies to impose controls for non-traditional reasons against a specific country for a specific reason. And so now that these new authorities and coordination and mindset of imposing controls for non-traditional reasons are in place, that those tools, that infrastructure, that mindset, that coordination, that sharing of information, that alignment of licensing policies among allies can be much more easily used with respect to other issues in other countries. So that's my 5-minute overview. I have a 30-minute and a 3-hour and a 3-day version. I do. Try me. That's my 5-minute summary, and happy to answer whatever questions.
That was great. Thank you so very much. And I know you do have the, you're informed with such great detail and experience. We'd like to turn the time now over to Maria to focus her remarks on the immediate and maybe the intermediate impact of all of these sanctions. We haven't even talked about energy, remember that, on the Russian leadership, on the Russian people. Will this make a difference? Because Russia has been so good at manipulating news and massaging its news to its people, will it be as effective at buffering reality, or will the Russian people start feeling this right away, and how and what difference will it make on the Putin regime? Maria, those are easy questions.
Exactly. Those are not easy questions to answer. And I wanted to remind to our audience, and by the way, thank you very much for having me today, that we are very early on in the stages of the crisis of what's happening. It's already feels very much like 1998, the biggest crisis Russia probably has experienced since early 1990s, since the transformation. And the financial crisis of 1998 is also important for comparative purposes. It's been argued in the past that one of the big events in Russia's contemporary history that made Putin possible, because it exacerbated the crisis at the time when Russians were just recovering from the painful effects of the economic transformation, sort of delivered the final blow. And that's when we see the post-Soviet nostalgia spike, and this image of this officer who is able to take things under control, emerging after which the political people in the policymaking circles essentially were branding Putin's image. Now we are, as I mentioned before, in the early stages, and it's, as been pointed out by previous participants, quite unprecedented scale and level of sanctions. So the effects are already being felt like what has been in the 1998. For example, the value of the Russian stocks that are traded in London has plummeted by 98%, which is more than the 94% decline in the stocks of Russia, which took place during the 1998 financial crisis. Similarly, for example, the inflation potentially already soared in just a week to 2.2%, according to Bloomberg data, the largest spike since, again, the 1998. But we are, as I said, very early on in this crisis. It's likely that the effects will be felt particularly in a more pronounced way for the Russian economy in early April. And of course, many of these effects, again, has been pointed out, are long lasting. So keep that in mind when interpreting these results. So thinking of possible macroeconomic effects, some of these things have already been summarized. We're likely to witness the effect, the shock to the Russian GDP, which according to, for example, Russia's oligarch Oleg Deripaska, will be three times larger than the 1998. This is really hard to estimate at this point. We can argue for sure that inflation will really skyrocket. Anders Osland, for example, predicts that the annual inflation rate will reach at least 50%, given everything that's going on. Of course, the Russians are likely facing a prospect of losing all of their foreign currency reserves. They already have been frozen by the Central Bank of Russia in an effort to control the inflation and the ruble. And living in Russia, for example, you can no longer do any operations with your foreign operations, transferring abroad your money held in dollars and euros, and you also cannot take more than $10 from your account, $10,000 from your account in the next 6 months. Now, what does it tell us about the possibility of the society influencing Putin? Yeah. First of all, the key groups that are being hurt at the moment, right? Unfortunately, not necessarily the targeted groups. This is likely to change, though. But as of now, we see, because of this essentially West cutting off and isolating Russia, it's more pro-Western liberal groups. They used to travel abroad, that hold foreign currency reserves, deposits in their accounts. Those are the ones who appear to be the primary targets at the moment. However, this is likely to change, especially when inflation skyrockets. Then we are likely to see lower income groups becoming a particular target. This is likely to create the social unrest, especially as there are issues with paying wages, which is probably going to be the case. We already saw last week a strike in Nizhny Kamsk, Tatarstan, when not Russians but Turkish workers actually protested over the depreciation of real wages. So this is beginning slowly but gradually. Keep in mind, however, that over 70 to 80% of Russia's GDP is now produced by the state-owned or state-linked corporations. So that is likely to soften the blow to the people, because it's likely that the state-controlled industries are going to be able to essentially compensate at least somewhat in rubles to their workers. The Russian government is also responding by offering to nationalize or essentially steal the facilities, the property of the companies that currently are refusing to work with Russia. And that is probably another source of income for the Russian state in order to sustain the situation. Now, what about the elites, the dark money and the oligarchs, right? This is another area which is being hit in an unprecedented coordinated action across Western democracies. We see the top Russian oligarchs who long escaped being sanctioned by the West, now finding themselves the key targets. Funny stories such as Abramovich's yacht disappearing because actually somewhere in the waters were too cautious to essentially approach anywhere closer to the Western European borders because it's likely to be seized. Actually, all of these sanctions that have been imposed in the recent days have already shown some effect. We see, in an unlikely move, the Russian oligarchs such as Oleg Deripaska and Michael Friedman slowly and cautiously start speaking up against this war. Particularly last week, the board of directors of Russia's largest private oil company, Lukoil, even called for an end of the war with Ukraine. That's another, again, oligarch Alekperov who essentially is behind this company. However, these signs are still very few, minor, and it's also unlikely to what extent the oligarchs are really in control of really have an impact on Russian decision making at this point. I'm sure many of you have witnessed, have seen the Security Council meeting 2 weeks ago, at which Putin essentially reprimanded, much like a high school teacher, the members of the Russian Security Council who dared to who hesitated to support his line, shall we say. So the Putin is right now isolated. The oligarchs, I don't think, are likely to fundamentally influence his stance on foreign policy. Our hopes lie with the Russian people, who are likely to really seriously feel the blow. And within a period of maybe several months or a year, Russia is likely to face some very serious, pronounced social unrest across the country. That is more likely, perhaps, to influence the calculus of both Putin and the Kremlin elites. The problem, however, is, of course, that in the recent years, the Russian society ability to influence Putin's decision-making has become increasingly limited. Paula has mentioned the lack of information. Right now, the last remaining surviving independent channels in Russia are banned, essentially no independent outlets are left. The only two places where you can still get information are YouTube, which is also on the threat of being banned, and Telegram, which in the past authorities tried to ban the app, but it's still, they failed. And so that's one of the key information sources. Last but not the least, what about China? China will be, at least there are high hopes among the Kremlin elites that China will be able to substitute some of the Western sanctions, particularly when it comes to payment systems and when it comes to the technologies. So far, however, the good news is probably due to the US pressure. China has been reluctant to assist Russia to large extent. It actually seems to be that China is complying with financial sanctions. For example, Chinese commercial banks are not providing finances to Russia. Shipments from Chinese manufacturers, today's news, Xiaomi, Oppo, and Huawei have halved, and Russia also refused to supply aircraft parts to Russian airlines, which is particularly important given that Russia's aviation industry is particularly strongly hit by the sanctions. We will see how this goes further. China is very much integrated in the world economy, much more than Russia, so it really is concerned that it will suffer a similar blow if it does assist Kremlin to a large extent. However, just a reminder, this is all unraveling fast, so we'll keep watching. Thank you.
Terrific. All of y'all have been so comprehensive. You've gotten back to my second and third questions, for example, but if I still have time, Ken, I would like to ask Alan and others, if they want to speak up, about other things we might be doing. The WTO, the Congress is like, all back even in the 70s, they're agitating. There are certain members who have their own personal and political ambitions to criticize what I think has been a very adroit, very quick, very diplomatic response by the Biden administration. But they last weekend wanted to get the US to push the WTO to push Russia out, for example, of the World Trade Organization. There was also an effort to remove most favored nation tariff treatment, the MFN, by law, as opposed to, if you will, potentially executive fiat from the White House. Alan, what more do you think this US government can do with its allied support to add more sanctions? And if others want to join in too, please let me know. Can't hear you.
A few quick points. I think it will be very important to sustain the effort to keep solid the remarkable alliance that's been created. The depth of cooperation between the United States, the countries of Europe, allies in Asia, and really countries all around the world who object strenuously to Russia's invasion is something that will require maintenance and diplomacy continuing going forward. I think it's going to be important to try to address the issue of China that has been brought up a couple of times. The Chinese government has given very strong rhetorical support for Russia. Like Putin, President Xi has a sense of grievance. He may see Russia as a strategic ally in sort of changing the world geopolitical framework. At the same time, as rightly has been pointed out, there's real serious question about whether China will go so far as to actively undercut U.S. sanctions or even violate, secondary sanction requirements that would relate to the space that Kevin was talking about. The supplies of technology related to that has U.S. Technology or parts associated with it. I think that we should expect that China will be studying what's going on, just as they studied the Gulf War and thought and took lessons in terms of the military lessons they should learn. They'll be taking lessons about how they ought to act to make their economy less vulnerable to the sort of sanctions regime that's been imposed on Russia so quickly. And finally, there's a whole set of issues that we haven't been discussing in any detail, but I think can be alluded to, and that's just the energy security issues. And there's so much that the U.S. Needs to be doing to increase global supplies of oil and natural gas in our own country, in other parts of the world, and in assisting the European countries in being more resilient, in particular on natural gas, where they have had a statistical heavy reliance on Russia.
Yeah, on the China thing, I do think that that's the tectonic shift I alluded to in the very beginning. And they've already, have had a terrible wheat harvest themselves in China, and they've taken off what restrictions they had on Russian wheat. So it's flowing. When it comes to energy, bigger purchases of coal, and of course, Russia is looking in every way how it can shift its flow of oil and gas to China. So that is kind of short term, but because China is this globalized, benefits from being a globalized member of the world economy, they have to decide whether they want to have a crippled Russia, which they're going to have, but how much that's going to cost China itself and how much they're willing to pay to prop up a crippled Russia economically. Do any of the other speakers want to jump in on this and add anything regarding other sanctions that could be piled on?
Yes, may I quickly jump in if possible? Two things. First of all, the global effects of what's going on are not quite well understood. For example, the Middle Eastern countries, the MENA region is highly dependent on Ukraine's grain, based on my understanding. And back in 2011-12, that's exactly what created this wave of the Arab Spring, right? The grain shortages, among other things. So thinking of substitutes and possible long-term effects that essentially cutting off Russia and Ukrainian supplies from the world market will have, and trying to compensate for that to avoid global turmoil, which will play into Putin's hands potentially, is one of the key focuses that I think should be done right now. Second is the US has a great capacity of producing shale oil and gas, particularly to keep pushing the prices down, because the problem is that even if Russia is cut off the energy markets, this is going to accelerate the oil and gas prices so much that Russia is likely to compensate by selling elsewhere. So one way to substitute for it is investing more into fracking. And this is why I think this clashes a little bit with Biden's policy on climate change, but I think at this point we could potentially sacrifice a little bit in one area in order to contain Russia more effectively. So thinking in that along those lines, I think is also important.
What about our supply of wheat? And what about our ability? Because this is going to be a serious secondary effect on, as you said, the Middle East and all countries that rely very much. Ukraine itself has been the breadbasket, as well as Russia, for the world. And we talked about, I heard about the planting season is coming up these first weeks of March in Ukraine. So that's going to be something that the US, as leader of the free world, and its allies are going to have to worry itself about. And Maria talked about a timetable a year out in terms of Russia feeling its effects. Does anyone want to comment on that subject, or to get back to my specific question about the WTO or any other future sanctions? Are there anything else in our toolbox from the free world?
So this is Clay. I'm not going to be able to comment on wheat outside of what I thought Maria pointed out, which is the commodity type of issues is going to have spillover effects, right? So there's going to be a spillover effect to Egypt because they're a pretty big wheat importer. There's going to be spillover effects to Turkey and probably to Egypt because there's actually a fair amount of Russian tourists that go to those countries. The spillover, I think, that we're going to see, of course, is going to be much more so towards Eastern Europe and potentially Western Europe, depending on what happens on energy issues. You'll probably see less of a spillover toward countries like Latin America, where actually a lot of them are commodity exporters. And so the kind of contagion risk from Russia, if you think about contagion, it usually comes through three channels. One is trade, which I think we're kind of talking about a fair amount. Two is through basically financial plumbing issues. And that might actually be significant. There's a reason the ECB did not tighten up monetary policy today, even though, of course, some of their rhetoric was a little bit different. And that's partially because even though there's inflation, they're very concerned about tightening up monetary policy in a situation where they're going to be looking for greater financial stability. And third, of course, and related to what I just said, is confidence, and just how does confidence go across different markets. I think that tightening up the sanctions issue that you mentioned, Paula, and Maria addressed a little bit is, look, the biggest hole right now, there's no question, is energy exports to Europe. That is a hole in the sanctions regime. The US closed its hole, or started to close its hole this week. There will be some of it will get closed because of basically almost like self-sanctioning. We're just not going to do business with these guys. Some of it will get closed by over-compliant sanctions, where you basically are like, look, I'm not going to make this margin of business for a reputational hit or potentially even a fine. So that's going to close it up. And by the way, there's a different way of being sanctioned, which is the Russian authorities might do it, which is to say, Putin and some of his folks around him have said, we're going to, hey, you want an economic war? Good, let's have one. And so that could suggest that they basically cut off exports to Western Europe. I mean, we haven't seen it yet, but that could happen. Now, obviously, that goes against a little of their interest because that's one of the few things that they have left to actually get hard currency. The other way around the sanctions regime, there's two more. One's diversification, and obviously, and I thought Al and Maria have also touched upon it, so I'm not going to go much further on the China issue. And then the other one is that we've heard about a lot is cryptocurrency type of issues. I would think that one seems to me to be wildly overstated. I think that it's something that maybe if you are a quote oligarch or if you are an individual in Russia, it might be a way around. But from an institutional perspective, it just doesn't seem like the market's large enough to handle these type of transactions. And there's a lot of ways basically using cryptocurrency. Actually, you can actually follow the money better than you can in some other aspects. So that's just kind of hitting on some of the aspects of this. I leave it to Maria as to, the pressure that kind of builds on Vladimir Putin, whether or not it means as much, or, I mean, the way I keep thinking it's going to mean something, I mean, and I hate to say this, I don't mean to say it in a crass way, is that if Russian soldiers start dying in Ukraine in a way, that I think is going to have a little more pressure on the regime. And as I said, I don't like saying that, but that I think is correct. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, fine. Ken, do you want to turn to questions from the audience?
I actually didn't want to interrupt this discussion, which has been great. And thanks to some of our panelists have been typing their answers and sending those back to people. I think others can see them as well. So we've done a few of them already. I think a few of the things that have come up relate to ways that Russia may try to get around sanctions. And I'm not saying illicitly get around sanctions, but working with countries that are not party to the sanctions. We've talked a bit about China, but what are the implications potentially for their doing business with China? You think about some of the concerns that the Western countries have had with using Chinese technology because it's their own embedded surveillance technologies that people have been concerned with, especially in some of the technology areas. Is Russia sort of a slave to China and this become economically tied to China in ways that they are going to be, China is going to be more embedded in the Russian system in ways that maybe is not something that President Putin and others anticipate or can get around at this point?
Yeah, if you want, I'll let others answer the broader question, but on the export control side, Secretary Raimondo very clearly said the other day that for Chinese companies that don't comply with these new extraterritorial controls, that is over non-US made items that are made with US tools and US software and US equipment, that she will not hesitate to put them out of business through their addition to the entity list, which would cut off access from the US of all content, all technology, all software, all commodities. And with the sectors that were at issue in the semiconductor, the aerospace, et cetera, US tools dominate worldwide. US software, US technology dominate worldwide, and it's almost impossible not to produce something outside the US without at some point during the production process using US equipment. It's more complicated, but essentially US equipment or foreign made equipment made from US technology and software. So I think that's a very credible threat that companies in China should take really quite seriously. And to the extent that they are producing items that are within the scope of the categories and the controls, which again, do not apply primarily to consumer civilian items, but the types of items that are key inputs for those sectors. My suspicion is that the impact will be significant, but I look forward to following the actual evidence of that. That's just a guess on my part.
How fast do you think it will take to see someone, a Chinese company, challenge that? And how fast do our enforcers and administrators deliver on Secretary Raimondo's very clear edict threat.
As someone who used to do this for a living, as quick as somebody can type the Federal Register notice and get it to the Federal Register. Inputs for information about companies that are not complying, it can come from a lot of different sources. They can come from media reports. They can come from intel, of course. They come from foreign competitors who are spending the money to comply with the rules. And that's where the biggest impact of these rules will come, is in multinationals that have a culture and a spirit of compliance, shutting down exports of controlled items. And as Clay said, even going beyond, but they feed that into the Commerce Department as well. And then ordinary investigative tools. And once an agreement is made among the 4 export control agencies, the ability to add entities to the list can occur very, very quickly. And there are many, many channels of information for companies that are not abiding by these extraordinarily novel and broad extraterritorial controls.
What a very rich response. Do you think we've gotten, you think we're going to get one of those challenges in the next day or two?
Well, I mean, next day or two, maybe a little soon. The rules are still, wet from the ink on the internet. So, I mean, this is all just now happening, and there is a delayed effective date, frankly, until March 26, where the 2 of the extraterritorial controls, because they are so novel and complex, I'm assuming that Commerce did that in order that non-US companies could even figure out what was affected by these rules, because nothing like it has ever been done before. And most companies don't have a clue as to whether the products are or not controlled. And then second, 30 or so allies are agreeing to have to change all of their laws in order to impose controls on exports from their countries of items that traditionally have not been controlled for these key sectors. And that's going to take some time for Korea and European countries and others to change the rules. So you're not going to see it in the next month, because technically it isn't illegal for the foreign direct product rule issues. But companies all over the planet, as media reports, are agreeing to, in the short term, voluntarily comply with the rules. And then a normal compliance practice is, until you know the impact of the rules, you shut off all of your exports until you can go through and decide what legal or illegal. And then for what's legal, then you make a business judgment as to whether you want to continue or not for other reasons.
What a great practice.
Just quickly say, it'd be safe to assume that there are a lot of people spending a huge amount of time within the Chinese government and within Chinese companies assessing exactly the issues that Kevin has raised. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a very intense dialogue between Washington and Beijing, including Commerce Department, State Department, and all relevant branches of the U.S. government.
Yeah, this is a bit like Huawei, the Huawei export controls on steroids,
Yes.
on speed.
So thank you. So if folks can just bear with us, we're at 11 o'clock, but I want to just give a couple minutes to close up here. Sorry for cutting this short. Obviously, there's a ton to cover here. Been a fantastic discussion. I'm very, very thankful to all of you. I guess I want to do 2 parts, sort of a little more big picture questions to close. I think looking at Maria and Alan a little bit, but also Kevin and Clay, if they want to jump in, and certainly you too, Paula. Maria and others, crystal ball, a little bit. It's a speculative question, but how do you think assuming that the sanctions are the situation on the ground becomes somewhat clearer in the next weeks or few months, whether it's an ongoing insurgency or the Russians back off, whatever that might be, what will be how will the Russian people react to these sanctions? What is going to be, that's the target of this, is the people to put pressure on the government and the oligarchs to put pressure on the government. Really, what might we see from that? And then Alan, I think to you, but also the others, what are the geopolitical implications of this long-term isolation of Russia? Well, how is it going to reorder? And I get, there's a big question of long-term, reorder US foreign policy. We're obviously having these very active discussions with Iran right now about the Iran nuclear deal, and potentially even with Venezuela. The enemy of the enemy is my friend sort of thing here, where we're, it's reordering. The US obviously got into, aligned with Stalin during World War II to oppose Hitler. So, what do we see here kind of geopolitically? Maria, maybe first on the pressure on the Russians.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Yes, so as we speak, multiple polls, I know they're not very reliable in autocratic regimes, but that's the only tool we've got, right? They show that 50 to 60% of Russians, unfortunately, side behind this war. Among these groups, a recent poll has shown, contrary to other previous studies, actually, that higher income groups tend to side are more likely to support the war. That is potentially because many of high income groups in Russian middle class are disproportionately people who work in the budget dependent sectors, nationalized industries, also security people. Of course, this data should be verified, but that's the reality. So you are likely from these results to conclude that as sanctions are going to be influencing the dynamic of the real disposable incomes, we are more likely to see decline in support for the authorities. That's the dynamic I, for example, myself have discovered in the past in the dynamic of support of the regional governors. That's what we have seen in 2018 when Putin, the Kremlin actually raised the retirement age, a highly unpopular reform in Russia, and that was actually a big blow to Putin's support. So that is definitely likely to create this unfavorable dynamic for the authorities, and in the long term, we're likely to see some social unrest. In the past, the core of Putin's majority of Putin's support, who are essentially particularly credited in Russia for creating stability and well-being, has been specifically the ability to provide high income. Because sanctions are targeting precisely that, it's guaranteed that the social unrest and unhappiness with the popularity of the authorities is likely to follow. The problem here is that enough to essentially to end the regime, right? Is that enough to fundamentally alter Putin's foreign policy? I think that actually is a function of multiple factors, and one negative factor that we're witnessing right now is that more pro-Western, more liberal Russians are disproportionately leaving the country as we speak. By some estimates, 200,000 of Russians have already left the country in Armenia, Georgia, all over Europe. You see these groups, they're horrified, they're afraid, they're disgusted, they didn't want to stay in the country. And so I think that a very likely prospect for us is to face this really Iranian tendencies when this supportive core that is perhaps also less likely to get hurt by the fact that they are being cut off from the West, they're likely to stay in the country and hence remain in one way or another, either controlled and forced to comply by the regime, or maybe that's something that aligns more closely with their preferences. Having said that, we are witnessing, as it's been pointed out, the unprecedented scale of country of this size, and this is really a dynamic in development. A lot of analysts think that Putin essentially is done. After this, I will be more cautious. I think that support for Putin will suffer a major blow, and that's the question of his ability to ultimately to control security forces, the violence repressive apparatus in the near term for him to be able to sustain. Last but not the least, if Putin is gone, unfortunately, that's not guaranteed. Russia will become liberal democracy the next day, right? A lot of other people who people nurtured into power are really more hawkish, not pro-Western attitudes. So I guess we will see. It's a serious blow to the Putin regime that we are witnessing, and potentially the beginning of the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Alan.
I'll give a very short answer to a very big question. In the long run, I think our children and grandchildren are going to live in a very, very difficult world. We're going to have a very adversarial relationship with Russia for as long as I can see, and I think we're going to have a very competitive relationship with China. And all of that will be against the backdrop of needing to work with other countries in the world to deal with new crises that we've seen, like pandemics that dominated the last 2 years, and issues like climate change, where everyone has to be part of the solution. So that's going to be tough. In the short run, it really has reshuffled the deck in ways that you alluded to. I remember going to try to persuade Hugo Chavez that he should ship more oil, before the U.S. moved into Iraq, and obviously that was a failure. Now it is an interesting question to see whether the release of 2 American hostages is the foreshadows bigger changes there that could be a factor in changing their relationship with Juan Guaido and their willingness to produce oil or not. On Iran, Russia is trying to take advantage of the situation by asking for assurances from the United States in writing that somehow, if there is a new JCPOA agreement, that it won't be penalized in any way. I find it hard to believe that the Iranians want their foreign policy and their issue annexed by Russia in that way. And so I don't have any prediction about how these very complex talks play out, but I do think it's a great example of your point that the deck has totally been reshuffled for almost every country in the world.
Yeah. Who would have thought we were going to talk about Venezuela? And I was going to avoid it because we weren't going to talk about energy. But the question that Ken put to us, requires us to factor that in. I guess my question is, the only thing I could add to this discussion is there's never been a military coup in Russia or the USSR. But there's been a lot, like Putin and Andropov, heads of the KGB who have headed the dictatorships there. So I'm wondering what the role of the security forces will be, or an individual will be. And of course, time will tell.
Well, we have a lot more we could certainly talk about. I often say that when we hold these sessions, I tell our panelists, think about like if you were sitting around a table at a bar in Washington and I was at the table next to yours and eavesdropping on your conversation. Well, that's the kind of discussion we like to have on these webinars, and I think you all have delivered. We are very grateful to you. There were a bunch of questions that got answered in writing by our panelists. We will send the questions to our panelists, the ones we didn't get to. They'll see who sent those, and if there's a chance to answer any of those, I'm sure they will. Thank you so very much. We will obviously have to follow up a lot here. Would love to have all of you back on, maybe even in a few months, so that we can bring this panel back together to see what have been the impacts and what's happening. So thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you, Paula, Alan, Maria, Kevin, and Clay. Hope everyone can join us tomorrow with the 4 big congressional trade councils. Find information on our website about that, and with the Korean Trade Minister on Tuesday. Thank you all very much. Be safe, take care, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.